At 7 a.m. on August 17th, 1943, the airfield at Dobodura didn't feel like a place that belonged to human beings. It felt like a machine that never stopped grinding. The air was thick with fuel fumes and wet heat. Every breath tasted like gasoline and dirt. Engines coughed and sputtered in the distance, like animals waking up angry. Men shouted over each other, not because they were excited, but because everything here was loud, urgent, and temporary. And under the left wing of a P-38 Lightning, Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched so still he could have been mistaken for a shadow. He wasn't holding a clipboard. He wasn't checking a gauge. He wasn't tightening a bolt. He was watching. That's what made it strange, because mechanics weren't supposed to watch like that. But McKenna couldn't help it. Not today. A few feet away, Lieutenant Robert Hayes was getting ready to fly, 23 years old. 6 combat missions, 0 kills. In a different world, that would just be a statistic. But here, those numbers had a smell. They smelled like burnt oil. They smelled like smoke. They smelled like the empty bunks back at camp that never got filled again. Hayes moved, like someone trying not to think too hard. He checked his straps. He checked his gloves. He climbed up into the cockpit like it was just another morning. But McKenna had seen enough to recognize the look in his eyes. It wasn't courage. It was calculation. The kind of calculation that happens when you've watched too many people die and you're quietly placing bets on whether you'll be next. And this morning, the odds were worse than usual because the Japanese weren't asleep. They had sent 18 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters to intercept the American morning patrol. 18 zeros. McKenna pictured them without even seeing them. Sleek, light, predatory, built for one thing, turning inside you until you couldn't breathe. And Hayes was flying straight toward them. McKenna had been maintaining P-38 Lightnings for 8 months. 8 months of working by feel, hands blackened with oil, knuckles split from tight spaces, fingertips numb from metal that never cooled down. 8 months of learning every sound that meant normal, and every sound that meant something's wrong. He knew the aircraft inside and out. On paper, the P-38 Lightning looked like the kind of airplane you'd invent if you wanted to scare the enemy into surrendering. Twin engines, twin booms, a cockpit pod in the center, like a bullet. It wasn't elegant. It was purposeful. It could climb high. It could dive fast. It could hit hard. And at high altitude, it could feel like an absolute beast. But McKenna didn't live on paper. He lived in reality, and reality had a rule that never stopped being true. The P-38 had one fatal problem. It couldn't turn with a 0. That wasn't a rumor. That wasn't gossip. That was physics. The 0 was lighter and more agile. It could roll and bite like a hawk. It could swing around in half the time. And in the kind of fights that happened over New Guinea low altitude, chaotic, fast turn speed was life. The American doctrine tried to fix that with words. Don't turn with a 0. Hit and run. Use speed and altitude. Strike from above. Then climb out. It sounded clean and smart. It sounded like control. But combat didn't follow doctrine. Combat followed panic. Combat followed instinct. And in the moment a 0 was on your tail and the sky was full of bullets, pilots didn't always get to do what the manual said. Hayes had tried the doctrine 5 times. 5 times, it hadn't worked. The 0s were too smart. They didn't always chase. Sometimes they climbed. Sometimes they reversed. Sometimes they waited for you to commit. And when you committed, they were already inside your turn like they'd predicted your thoughts. In the past 6 weeks, the The 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38s. 37. That number didn't live on a chart for McKenna. It lived in the faces he remembered. And every time another one went down, the official explanation was the same. Pilot error. Not the plane, not the design, not the system. Pilot error. McKenna had watched too many pilots die to accept that. He'd heard instructors say the pilots weren't following doctrine, that they weren't disciplined, that they weren't thinking. But McKenna had stood close enough to those planes to know what thinking looked like. And he'd heard enough screams on radios to know what discipline sounded like when someone was burning alive. There had to be something else, because it kept happening in the same way. The first pilot McKenna lost to a zero was Lieutenant David Chen. July 9th, 1943. Chen had been in theater for 3 weeks. 3 weeks is nothing, barely enough time to learn where the mess tent is. Barely enough time to stop flinching at every distant engine noise. McKenna worked on Chen's aircraft every morning. He saw how Chen treated the plane the way a man treats a lucky charm. Not because he believed in magic, but because he needed something to hold on to. Chen took off early, around 0615, on a fighter sweep. 2 hours later, he came back. And even before the plane rode to a stop, McKenna saw the holes. 3 bullet holes in the left boom. Not scattered, not random, grouped tight. Perfect deflection shooting. Chen climbed down and talked fast, like he needed the words out of him before the fear hardened into silence. He said a zero had gotten close. He said he tried to roll out, tried to dive away, but the airplane felt slow to respond. Slow, not broken, not dead, just a fraction late. McKenna stared at the holes and felt something cold settle in his stomach, because those holes looked like the zero pilot hadn't just shot where the plane was. He'd shot where the plane would be. He'd led Chen perfectly. And if Chen was right, if the airplane delayed just long enough, then the zero pilot didn't need luck. He only needed timing. Chen didn't fly again. 3 weeks later, McKenna heard Chen had been killed flying a different P-38. A different plane. Same story. Then it was Captain William Morrison. Morrison was not a rookie. He was a squadron leader. Experienced. 11 confirmed kills. He knew the P-38 inside and out. If Morrison could be killed because he was making mistakes, then the word mistake didn't mean anything anymore. On August 3rd, Morrison's flight intercepted 8 zeros. He got one on the first pass. Clean. Textbook. Then 2 zeros reversed on him. And Morrison did what any human being might do. When something is trying to kill you, he tried to move. He tried to roll. Over the radio, he caught out that his controls felt mushy. Mushy. It wasn't a word pilots used when they were bragging. It was a word you used when the plane felt like it wasn't listening. Moments later, Morrison was shot down at 4,000 feet. His wingman said it looked like Morrison's airplane wasn't responding fast enough. Afterward, the maintenance crews went over Morrison's aircraft records. They looked for obvious failures. They checked what they could check. Everything was within spec. And the official report said, pilot error. One of the other crew chiefs, Rodriguez, was convinced something was wrong with Morrison's aircraft. McKenna felt the same, because by mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 pilots die. 17. He watched them taxi out, watched them take off, watched them disappear into bright sky. And then, nothing. And in between the deaths, there were the survivors. The ones who came back told the same story in different words. A slight lag, a tiny delay between what they did with their hands and what the airplane did with its wings. Most people would ignore that, because slight lag sounds harmless, but in a turning fight, slight is lethal. McKenna stopped trusting manuals. He started paying attention to the machines like they were living things. He listened. He plucked the cables and noticed the sound. Loose cables sounded different. They didn't ring the same way. They didn't answer with the same sharpness. Tracing the aileron control system, he followed where the cables ran through the twin booms into the tail section. And there it was. Slack, just 3/8 of an inch, within specifications. A number that looked safe on paper. But at low speeds, that fraction of a second delay was the difference between rolling inside a zero's turn and getting shot down. McKenna reported it. He tried to talk to officers, and the answer came back cold and clean. The tension was within spec. Changing it would void Lockheed's warranty. No field mechanic had authorization to modify flight control systems. In other words, don't touch it. Follow the rules, and if pilots die, write pilot error and move on. McKenna stood there, hands still smelling of metal, and realized something simple and brutal. The rules were written far away from here. The rules were written by people who didn't have to listen to a pilot's radio go silent. That's when Robert Hayes came to the maintenance area. Not loud, not dramatic, just desperate. He didn't talk about doctrine. He didn't talk about strategy. He asked if there was anything McKenna could do. McKenna looked at him and saw a kid who knew he was going to die. And that was the moment the story stopped being about aircraft specifications and became about a choice. McKenna told Hayes to come back in the morning. Then he waited for night, because if he was going to do what he was thinking of doing, he couldn't do it where anyone could see. The night air at Dobodura didn't feel cooler. It just felt heavier. The noise faded, but it never vanished. There were always distant engines, always footsteps, always some part of the base moving like a restless animal. McKenna went to Hayes's P-38 like a man walking toward a line he couldn't uncross. He worked alone. No witnesses, no paperwork, no permission. He pulled the inspection panel off the aircraft, exposing the control system like you were peeling back skin. Then he grabbed the cable with both hands and pulled. The slack was obvious, not subtle, not theoretical. It moved. And as he felt it, McKenna's anger sharpened into something dangerous. Because this wasn't a mystery. This wasn't maybe. This was wrong, and it was killing people. The official world said the system was within specifications, but McKenna could feel the truth in his hands. Now, the question was, what do you do when the truth is illegal? He didn't have factory parts. He didn't have engineering support. He didn't have time. He had scraps. Nearby, there was wreckage, damaged aircraft parts, twisted metal, pieces of machines that had already lost their war. McKenna found what he needed in something almost absurd. A piece of piano wire. Thin, strong, springy. The kind of wire meant for music, not survival. He took it and bent it into a Z shape. A crude inline tensioner. Not pretty, not official, but he understood what mattered. A small increase in tension, less than half a pound, could eliminate slack. Slack was the enemy. Slack created delay. Delay created death. He tried to fit it into place. His hands slipped once, then again. On the second slip, the wire cut his thumb. Blood immediately mixed with grease, turning dark. He wiped it on his coveralls. Kept working. Because out here, you don't stop for pain. You stop for consequences. And the consequences were everywhere. Shadows shifted across the cable system as someone walked by outside. McKenna froze, listening. His heart pounded so hard he could feel it in his throat. If anyone caught him, this wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was court-martial territory. He imagined an officer's voice, unauthorized modification, tampering with flight controls, endangering a pilot. He imagined the worst outcome, Hayes dying anyway, and McKenna being blamed for it. And still, he kept working, because he had watched 17 pilots die. And he wasn't going to watch an 18th die for pilot error when his hands were literally holding the reason. Finally, the tensioner seated. The cable went tight. No slack. McKenna tested the control surface. This time, it moved immediately. Not after a breath. Not after a hesitation. Immediately. Perfect. He stared at it and felt something that he hadn't felt in months. Hope. But hope is fragile here. Hope is the thing that gets crushed in the morning. At 1:15 a.m., McKenna wiped the blood off the wire and closed the panel. He cleaned as much as he could. He left no obvious sign. Because if this became a conversation, it would become a crime. He walked away, knowing a terrible truth. If Hayes died tomorrow, McKenna would carry it forever. Morning came fast. At 7:42 a.m., Hayes taxied to the runway. McKenna watched him from the ground. Expression unreadable. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He said nothing. Because what could you say when you had just gambled a man's life against a regulation? Hayes took off. The aircraft lifted, wheels folding in, engines roaring. And McKenna could do only one thing now. Wait, out over Huan Gulf. Hayes' flight intercepted 9 zeros. 9. Not 18, but enough. Enough to turn the sky into a trap. It was the kind of setup that could go wrong in seconds. And then Hayes dove. The nose dropped. Speed built. Wind screamed. This was the moment. If the airplane delayed, if it lagged, if it refused, then Hayes would be dead before he even understood why. But it didn't. The airplane responded instantly. No delay. No lag. The first zero's engine exploded. A bright flash. A violent shudder in the air. The enemy aircraft collapsing and falling toward the jungle below. Hayes didn't stop. He rolled again. The movement was clean, sharp, fast, like the plane had finally remembered what it was supposed to be. The second zero fell 30 seconds later. Then a third. 3 kills. 3. For a pilot with 0 kills in 6 missions, 3 kills was not just success. It was a miracle with teeth. When Hayes came back, the P-38 rolled onto the airfield like it carried a secret inside it. The engines shut down. The propellers slowed. Hayes climbed out and walked straight toward McKenna. No celebration, no shouting, just a look, wide-eyed, almost disbelieving. He said 2 words. It worked. And in that moment, McKenna felt the ground shift, not the earth, the future. Because if it worked for Hayes, it could work for everyone. But secrets don't stay secrets on an airfield full of men trying to survive. Captain Frank Mitchell saw Hayes' P-38 rolling faster than any lightning he had ever seen. Mitchell wasn't the kind of man who ignored patterns. He asked what was different. Hayes didn't explain in public. He pointed to McKenna. Talk to him. Mitchell confronted McKenna, and McKenna told the truth. The piano wire tensioner, the cable modification. Mitchell didn't hesitate. If there was something that could help them survive, he wanted it. Because that's what war does. It turns rules into luxuries. McKenna performed the change. Fast, quiet, 8 minutes. And when Mitchell flew, the plane rolled like a fighter instead of a truck. That phrase spread because it was exactly how it felt. Like the P-38 had been dragging something invisible, and now it wasn't. Soon, other pilots wanted it. Other crew chiefs started doing it. They taught each other how to bend the wire, how to fit it, how to hide it. No meetings, no approvals, just a survival moving through the ranks like electricity. By September, the statistics were impossible to ignore. The kill ratio was nearly even. Then it tipped, and the Japanese began reporting something strange. American P-38s were maneuvering more aggressively, not differently in a way you could point to on paper, but differently in a way that changed timing, changed rhythm, changed the way a fight felt. One of the pilots who noticed was Saburo Sakai, an ace, a man who understood air combat like language. Sakai tried to bait a P-38 into a turning fight because that's what worked before. Except this time, the P-38 reversed with him. Not slow, not heavy, not late. It reversed like it had been waiting. Sakai had to dive away. He returned to base confused and frustrated because the world had changed and no one could see why. Japanese intelligence examined wreckage. They searched for obvious modifications. They found none. They never noticed the tiny piece of piano wire hidden inside the control system. And slowly, something began to break. Not the airplanes, the confidence. Because confidence is built on predictability. And predictability had just been stolen. All because one mechanic refused to believe the lie that 17 pilots had died from pilot error.